welcome to all of our panelists and to the audience today. For those who don't know me, my name is Shasta Gaughan. I am the Environmental Director and the Tribal Historic Preservation Officer for the Pala Band of Mission Indians in northern San Diego County on Poyam-Kawitcham or Luiseno territory. And I acknowledge the lands that we are all on are all tribal lands. Some of you may be in the Kumeyaay lands, some are in Luiseno or Cahuilla lands. If you want to put that in the chat or in the question, let us know where you are today. And so now I'm going to give each of our panelists an opportunity to introduce themselves and their work. They're going to have about 5 minutes each. So we're going to start with Dr. Dan Cahan from the California-Nevada Applications Program at Scripps Institute of Oceanography. Dr. Cahan, take it away.
Thanks, Shasta. First of all, can you hear me?
Yes.
Great. Hi, everybody. I'm Dan Cahan. I'm a climate researcher at Scripps, and we focus in my group on regional climate with an emphasis on California climate variability and climate change. We were asked about, in sort of prepping for this panel, features of our research that, of course, bear on the summit with, I think, some glimmer of optimism for the future. And of course, many of climate change impacts that we are being confronted with are going to be great challenges. There's one aspect that I think I'd like to mention that is kind of a dual-edged sword. That being, well, climate change in many ways will accentuate extremes and the kinds of impacts that we're already confronted with. There is one form of extreme that actually carries benefit as well as levies a risk. And that's heavy rainfall bearing storms that occur in this region, which in the climate model future, of course, models are the lens that we look forward with. These storms, atmospheric rivers, are actually projected in some cases to get richer in terms of their moisture content and thus deliver more precipitation and in some cases greater floods. But in fact, atmospheric rivers provide us with probably at least half of the water supply in the state of California, including Southern California. So while these extremes are still going to be a risk and a threat, the fact that in future times we will be able to project them and understand them better with both long and short-term forecasts, that's going to be a help in managing the water that does come with them. So the other thing that I would note is that globally, Mediterranean regions are projected to become drier because of atmospheric rivers. Well, Southern California, northern Mexico are likely to become drier. They may not be as strongly inflicted as other Mediterranean regions globally. So I will close on that note and turn it back over to you, Shasta, and look forward to more discussion.
Great, thank you so much, Dan. And I don't think I gave actually the title of the panel in my introduction, so just to clarify that this is the Perspectives panel on building resilience to extremes. So obviously, Dan, you addressed that. Now we're going to move on to Laura Engemann of California Sea Grant.
Hi there. I'm grateful to be here today as part of this whole summit. Thank you so much for having me. I am a coastal resilience specialist. I work at Scripps Institution of Oceanography between two different departments. One is California Sea Grant, which works across the state of California with coastal communities to protect, restore, and better understand our relationship with marine and coastal systems. And then I also work for the Center for Climate Change Impacts and Adaptation at Scripps, which involves a number of climate researchers focused, a number of them focus on the coastal and marine environment. My role is largely to think about the science through the lens of how communities can really use that science to help understand the coast and the marine ecosystem, but also to really, at this point, as we've talked about, we can look at our risks, but how do we move forward? So really trying to figure out how that science can be used to help us think about how we better prepare for some of these extreme storms, but also how we can experiment and design strategies that can help us buffer impacts from those extreme storms in the short term and in the long term. So want to use my background as just also a quick introduction to help make the case that when we think about climate change and we think about coasts, we often go straight to sea level rise. But one important context to think about, as Dan mentioned, is that we are one entire system. And right here, where the coast meets the ocean, is a great place to sort of think about how our climate and atmospheric science is related to the ocean health, and then in turn is related to the weather and extreme types of storms that we may be seeing. So we are all very much connected. So continuing to sort of look at that expanse where we land-dwelling people look out onto the ocean is a good reminder of how we are all one system and one people.
And thank you so much, Laura. And so far, you guys aren't using your full 5 minutes, but that's fine because that gives us more opportunity to have a conversation. So now we're going to turn to Dr. Hugh Stafford of the U.S. Forest Service.
Yeah, that's awesome, man. I never get on when someone hasn't used all their time. I'm going to use most of that, I think. So anyway.
Don't make me cut you off.
Yeah. Well, it's a success if you have to cut me off, right? Really. So I'm the regional ecologist for the Forest Service. I work mostly in sort of vegetation, ecosystem, and fire-related aspects. And I'm an applied scientist, so my job is essentially to translate and interpret science for managers, particularly for the Forest Service, but I work with a lot of other agencies as well. And I have an adjunct research position at UC Davis. So what I decided to do was I was going to talk briefly about the types of climate extremes that we're probably most concerned with in our management in the Forest Service, and then to discuss with you a little bit about what we're trying to do about those things, particularly in SoCal. And I would say that in terms of the trends that are tied to extremes, I think that probably the increased occurrence of multi-year droughts is a major issue for us, particularly given that we're mostly managing terrestrial ecosystems. Before 1950, you would have 2 to 3 year droughts about every 20 to 30 years, but since 1950, it's about every 10 to 15 years. And since 2000, nearly every year's been a drought. So, I mean, you guys live in SoCal and you know what it's like, and it's just getting worse and worse. Another one is the increased variability in precipitation. And a lot of that's tied to the arrival of the atmospheric rivers that Dan referred to. Southern California actually has the most variable precipitation regime of all of the world's Mediterranean climate regimes. It's actually becoming worse over time, which just simply means you end up with no years that are the long-term average. You just end up with a lot of really wet years and a lot of really dry years with nothing in between. And then finally, the rate of climate warming in Southern California is extremely high. It's probably higher than anywhere else in North America, actually. And that's exacerbated by an urban heat island effect. But if you look at any of the stations, in the LA Basin, San Fernando Valley, out by San Bernardino, they've all gone up 2 to 6 degrees Fahrenheit over the last 75 to 100 years. And in high elevations, the amount of snow is dropping quickly, and the length of the frost-free period is dropping a lot too. It's down by a month to 2 months over the last 75 years. So in terms of the impacts of those things, that are important to us. Probably the first one is the fact that fire seasons are notably longer, and indeed in Southern California, I mean, you basically have a year-long fire season now. We used to kind of joke about that, but it's the reality now. Secondly, the period of critically dry fuels is expanding, and the increased prevalence of multi-year droughts and the warming and drying summers are leading to increased vegetation mortality, and not just from fire, but also from just straight drought, from beetles, from insect mortality. And that's also, this increased vegetation mortality is also leading to larger and faster spreading fires. And then a fire in chaparral has always been a real concern in Southern California, but one of my major concerns now is the fact that we're starting to see larger and larger fires in the montane sky islands that you have in Southern California, and we're losing a lot of the sort of the moist, stream-based and higher elevation ecosystems like riparian forest, stream corridors, montane and subalpine forests. And then finally, obviously, these trends lead to major variability in stream flow. They raise stream temperatures, and you have increased probability of completely dry streams in one year and streams overflowing with massive floods the next. So one of the real issues we've got is that if you look at the paleo history, really long droughts in Southern California usually lead to expansion of things like coastal sage scrub and chaparral, but coastal sage scrub is pretty much disappearing under homes, and chaparral is burning up in larger and larger fires all the time and transitioning to weed fields. And so that's kind of a challenge for us in terms of managing long term. And then we've got this issue with conservation of moist, stream-based, and higher elevation ecosystems that are going to require a lot of sensitization. I don't think the public really understands the major threat that we're seeing at those elevations and in the places at this point. So I wanted to finish talking about what we're trying to do about some of these things. I don't think slow climate-driven change is our main focus. I think our major issue is these climate-enhanced disturbances that can very quickly transform landscapes, right? Things like fire, floods, debris flows, and other erosional events. And we've got two main focus areas in the Forest Service. There's ecological restoration and then fire and fuels management, and they're very highly interrelated. So I'll just speak broadly real quickly and then get to some of the on-the-ground stuff. So I manage a staff of ecologists in the region in kind of a unique program. We're boundary spanners, and like I said, we kind of interpret, translate science for managers. So we have a foot in science and a foot in management. And some of the tools we've been trying to develop in Southern California include an ecosystem services assessment process in chaparral landscapes, where we're trying to get the public and the agency to better understand ecosystem service values in what are generally pretty undervalued landscapes. It also can help support natural resource damage assessments in chaparral fires, like actually taking into account impacts to ecosystem services like carbon, water, erosion mitigation, things like that. Allows managers to better understand ecosystem service trade-offs of inaction or action. And we've also got a sub-project where we're looking at climate change impacts. We also have a tool that IDs priority areas for restoration in chaparral that's based on shrub regeneration capacity, droughts, competition, drought tolerance, things like that. And then we also have a restoration strategy we've developed for the National Forest in California to make this kind of stuff work. And then finally, just to hit on a couple of the things that are happening on the Cleveland National Forest and some of the other local forests, they've been pretty focused on stream and sedimentation issues. I was told this morning that the Cleveland's been involved in removing more than 80 dams in Orange County, I guess mostly in the Santa Anas. They've also restored more than 70 miles and decommissioned more than 70 miles of roads. In terms of chaparral and coastal sage scrub, there's been a real focus, obviously, in fire suppression in chaparral to reduce burning and pipe conversion. And the forest actually did an analysis of the fuel treatment network and has removed some of the fuel treatments from the network, and they're allowing those to revert back to chaparral. And there is also some attempt to do some coastal sage scrub restoration in some parts of the national forest. And then lastly, I wanted to focus a little bit on montane forests. We have a new program that we're starting right now with the help of USGS, Southwest Climate Adaptation Science Center, where we're developing a montane forest conservation strategy for Southern California and Northern Baja California. We're doing that work in collaboration with San Diego State University and with the California Climate Alliance. Also, the Cleveland has got forest health restoration type projects going on Palomar Mountain and on Laguna Mountain. You know, classic fire risk abatement stuff like fuel reduction, thinning, and prescribed fire. But those will also reduce forest densities, which will lead to less water stress, a lot less mortality due to drought, fiery beetles, and also more biodiversity. And I'll just note finally that a lot of the reforestation efforts around the region, i.e. California in my case, are also starting to experiment with lower elevation genotypes and species. And we're trying to get a feeling for how well they're going to be able to help us maintain forest cover in the landscape in the long run. That's it. Thanks.
All right. Thank you, Hugh. That's a lot to digest, and I'm looking forward to being able to expand on that when we break out. But our next panelist is Audrey Carver. She is an affiliated artist, a very talented one for the Climate Science Alliance. So Audrey.
Hello, thank you, Shasta. Like she said, I'm Audrey, and I am a Climate Science Alliance affiliated artist. I'm also currently a student at Tufts University. I'm studying climate science and visual art and anthropology. So the jury is still out on what exactly I will do with that. But I've been working for the Climate Science Alliance as an affiliated artist since I was 16. And my goal as an artist is to connect people to their environment and to kind of engage the public in climate stories and climate narratives that are coming up in Southern California specifically. So it might seem kind of odd for there to be an artist on a panel of researchers. I definitely kind of feel like the odd duck out sometimes in this work, but I think that kind of goes back to something that a lot of us were taught in school, that there's like right-brained people and left-brained people. You know, there's this kind of division between creativity and science and reason. And I really think that they go better together. So the more work that I do in this, the more that I'm realizing how similar art and science are as like exploratory kind of creative processes that are trying to engage other people in the way that you see the world. So I'm really excited to continue doing this work and to see where it goes, and excited to talk to you all about it later. So thank you.
Great, thank you, Audrey, and thank you, panelists, for those introductory, introductory remarks. And Audrey, actually, I'm going to start with you because I think you said something really important, which is this nexus of science and art. And also, because I am an anthropologist, let me just give a shout out for please do continue your studies in anthropology. But you know, just beyond that, can you expand a little bit on that? Why do you think it's important to have that nexus, and how do you see art connecting people to the science of climate change?
That's a very good question, and it's one that I'm really excited to talk about. So I think that art and science, really the way that I see it, kind of make each other better, stronger. I think that art can work with science in a couple of ways. I think that it can, one, be as an educational process really valuable. So kind of teaching for kids and adults, using art as a way to kind of think creatively, think outside of the box, like use a lot of observation tools, and just like curiosity, right? Both of those are really important. I think that art can be helpful to science. Like public art can help kind of foster a community investment in a space. So like public art projects and art initiatives that can kind of pull people in, I think makes them more invested in the space that they're in, or maybe more aware of it. And then finally, I think that art is a really valuable tool for communication. So a lot of what I work on with the Climate Science Alliance and with my majors at school is kind of taking data and taking climate knowledge and things that are happening in the science world and making it into an image that can be easily disseminated and like kind of help communicate what's going on in a way that more people can understand. And that also is more visually engaging and, you know, kind of more personal. You get the storytelling aspect in there as well of the science. So I guess kind of, you know, interpreting data in a way that's easily spread and easily understood. Yeah.
All right, thank you. And actually, I see Dan nodding there in agreement. So just because we're not used to having the art side of things, I want to just explore this a little further and challenge our researchers on that. And I'll start with you, Dan. How do you see art as being something that can help communicate to people about the extremes that we are facing?
Well, you're putting me on the spot, Shasta.
Well, yeah.
What I would say in being involved in a project or multiple projects that aim to interface climate science results with decision makers is that different people, different organizations think differently, see things through different lens, learn differently, and so forth. And I think we need multiple devices to communicate. So I think that one enormous challenge that we have with this problem, which is called a wicked problem because it's relatively slowly developing, but has enormous consequence, and it's occurring in the noise of many other issues that are more immediate. So it's difficult to gain people's attention and their serious consideration of these issues. I think that art is a way to make climate and climate problems more visible, more recognized, and generate a discussion across a wide variety of our society, which of course is again one of the huge challenges, getting broad scale recognition, buy-in, and action on these issues. So that would be my answer, and I'm sure that that others have thoughts about this as well. Thanks, Shasta.
Of course. And we could continue on this topic, but I'll let you just sort of integrate those ideas, I think, as you respond to to other topics and other questions. And so, Laura, I want to ask you about some of your work. And coastal resilience to extremes is really an important topic for us to address. And are you seeing a lot of traction in the strategies or the implementation for dealing with these extremes? And what do you think we need to be doing to address those extremes on the coast?
Yeah, I think that discussion is a good tie-in with extremes on the coast and better understanding them. So as I mentioned earlier, we often think of sea level rise, but I think that is often coupled with what we think about in terms of our resilience to extreme coastal storms. So in the short term and the near term, we currently have sand-starved beaches. We also have, as Dan and Hugh mentioned, a very variable climate, which means for the coast that we're also very vulnerable to El Nino type conditions that can increase wave energy that helps continue to erode our cliffs and our beaches, and king tides, which often cause larger water levels and increased flooding along our low-lying areas in the coast. We also have these estuaries that are both vulnerable to conditions coming from the ocean side of things in terms of wave energy and flooding, but also when those are combined with things like atmospheric rivers, you've got heavy flows coming from the land-based side, which increases the flooding risks or changes to those systems. So as we think about those extremes, and we talk about those extremes in terms of how they affect our coastal environment, we have to keep in mind that our coastal environment is a very dynamic system and it changes constantly. And these extremes are also constantly eating away at what what I would call the buffering systems that those coastal systems provide for sort of long-term sea level rise and for increases in these intensity and duration of these storms. So sand provides a buffer for our beaches, cliffs provide a buffer for sort of retreat inland, estuaries provide buffer, and wetlands provide buffer for flooding. And these extreme storms are starting to erode those systems. And as those systems erode, our resiliency also erodes. So tying it back to the art and visuals, one of the really key components for us to really tangibly understand how those risks are increasing and how quickly we need to respond is really tracking what happens during these big El Nino events or these king tide events, and not just how those systems impact our beaches. So, you know, looking to see how much sand may have been lost on the beach, but how well our systems are able to rebound. Oftentimes that happens in a year or 2 years, and our systems historically have been able and capable of rebounding from these types of extreme events. But as we're getting further and further down this road of more extreme events and more frequency, and also land change, our man-made changes to these coastal systems, we're seeing that that bounce back capability is significantly reducing. And that is the key to understanding resilience, both for people and our ecosystems in our coasts. The same relates to, as I mentioned, the ocean system in terms of, you know, how well is our ocean system bouncing back or handling these ocean warming events, and how is that affecting our climate and also our coastal systems at the same time. So the visuals are going to be critical, and there's a super great role for citizens to start playing in terms of helping to be our eyes for the coasts. Researchers cannot be everywhere all at once, especially when these big El Nino events happen, and so we need the eyes of our citizens, and we need our citizens to be able to connect to what's happening during these events and what happens afterwards, and be sort of the observers for us. So videos and photos and ways to interpret these changes, to me, that is going to be a great way for us to further connect with our communities and work together towards a revision of how we want to see these systems move forward.
Thank you, Laura. Yeah, I agree wholeheartedly. And you're talking about it from the coastal side of things, but that also takes us, well, not just coastal, but throughout the state. You know, so Hugh, your discussion of wildfire, which is obviously an issue that we're experiencing as we speak. And I'll observe that our approach to the extreme of wildfire for the past several decades, even almost a century, has been wildfire suppression. And there actually is an art component to that, in the sense of the Smokey Bear, you know, only you can prevent forest fire kind of thing, which ultimately has led us to, you know, those weren't the best management practices, as it turns out. So what would you say about the extreme of fire and helping the public develop resilience to that as an extreme?
Well, I would say, first of all, that's a great question. And I would say, first of all, that, yeah, Smokey is kind of a conflicted character, but with respect to a lot of Southern California, Smokey is exactly the right icon, because the impact in Southern California has largely been much more fire than those systems naturally experienced, rather than less. It is true that once you get west of, you know, the eastern side of the Rocky Mountains, that most of the landscape, and it's quite unique in the world because humans almost always bring more fire to ecosystems and not less. But through fire suppression, we've created some really major issues in Western forests, and those issues are occurring and are important in the tops of your sky islands in Southern California, in the San Bernardinos and the San Gabriels and San Gorgonio Mountain, the San Jacintos, Laguna Mountain, Mount Palomar. But in most of the landscape, to be candid, absolute full fire suppression is a complete necessity, and it's a conservation treatment as much as it is risk abatement and trying to keep people alive and save homes, because a lot of your coastal sage scrub and chaparral is just burning up and turning to weeds, and is having a lot of impacts on things like erosion events, debris flows, invasion, ability of you know, sort of unlawful use, sometimes in the form of OHV use, et cetera, on landscapes. And it's also abetting a lot of invasion by species which are beginning to occupy large areas of country where they really couldn't if it were covered in older chaparral. So that's been a real challenge for us because there's so much fire. I mean, the Cleveland puts out, they must put out hundreds of ignitions every year that don't turn into fires. And so 75% of the average Southern California National Forest budget is spent completely on fire suppression, which means there's less money for recreation, less money for restoration, less money for conservation, less money for all sorts of other things as well. So I would say if we're, our panel title is, what is it? Building Resilience to Extremes, right?
Yes.
So what you have is a situation where coastal sage scrub and chaparral actually are very resilient ecosystems. But most ecosystems are relatively resilient as long as the environmental baseline, the climate, and the disturbance regimes that they're subjected to, kind of fall within a general range of variability within which the species adapted. And that's probably one of our major challenges in conservation and in management these days, is trying to ensure that we don't see rapid, change in that respect, because you do get, major impacts, not just from the conservation side, but also geomorphological impacts and things like that. And so if you look at the mountains, once you start getting into ponderosa pine and black oak, the situation is completely different. And what used to be systems that had relatively frequent fire driven by lightning impacts haven't had much fire at all in the last 100 years, and they've become jungles of fuels. And when we get in ignitions there, or say fires that come up out of the chaparral under Santa Ana conditions, we're just burning out huge chunks of forest these days. And I try to be realistic, but I'm very fearful that in 50 to 60 years, you may not have any more montane forest in Southern California. You may not have a place for people to go to get in the shade and to go hiking in wilderness areas. And a lot of your streams are going to be flashy and pulling a whole lot of sediment down them as they go. And it's going to take some real thinking about what we do about that, and some real dialogue with conservationists in Southern California, because people's first response when they hear that the Forest Service is cutting trees is to go out and chain themselves to a tree. And in some instances, that makes sense. But in a place that's adapted to a lot of fire and a lot of drought on the landscape, when we fill the forest with thousands of straws in the drink, there's no water for anyone anymore, and something has to be done about it. And generally, that thing involves removing trees. And so we have to do a better job of making the ecological and the conservation case for that work. And organizations like the Climate Alliance and other groups can work with us in trying to do a better job of outreaching to the public about why maintaining that kind of resilience in ecosystems is really important, and how active human management can actually help to abet that.
So I'm going to interrupt the flow here just briefly to remind our listeners that if you have a question, please put that into the Q&A and not into the chat box. But we do have questions queuing up, so everybody be ready for when we reach that moment. But I want to return to Dan, because I started with asking you about art, but since we are dealing with resilience to extremes, you've been working on this for such a long time, and I imagine that you have all sorts of ideas on how we can build, resilience based on the key findings in your research. So can you give us an idea of what are the most important things we should be paying attention to?
Yeah, thanks, Shasta. So you put me back on my home ground. This has come out in both Laura and Hugh's remarks, that the extremes that we're experiencing are being exacerbated by the longer term changes underlying those. And that really underscores the really critical role of modeling climate futures, as well as better understanding our historical past in order to prepare for some of the dry episodes and events and El Nino driven catastrophic storms, that sort of thing. I would just point out that we're in the sort of early phase of anthropogenic change. We've seen conservatively, despite the numbers that Hugh said, which are really spectacular in some of the longer term weather stations in Southern California that are plagued by urban problems. But my number is 1 to 1.5 degrees Celsius of warming since the 1920s when you look at kind of a broader regional lens. We are anticipating, and we are committed to, because of greenhouse gas buildups, considerably more climate warming as the Earth tries to achieve a radiative balance. Right now, we're out of balance because the greenhouse gas blanket is absorbing terrestrial radiation, and the system is consequently warming up. And by the way, a lot of the excess heat, the great amount of the excess heat, is being deposited in the oceans. And of course, that bears on problems that Laura's talking about. But we think by the middle part of the century, we'll probably see at least another degree Celsius of warming. And I would, excuse me, I got a cell phone bothering me. I would note that with every degree Celsius of warming, just in broad brush, we lose about 20% of the California spring snowpack, to, as one metric of that. For each additional degree Celsius of global warming, there's likely to be about a foot, 30 centimeters of additional sea level rise, and so forth. But along with that, our climate still contains all of these high frequency weather and natural climate phenomena, such as big Pacific storms and El Niños and Santa Anas and so forth. So the modeling and climate analyses now, there's a community that's pushing the resolution, the ability to look at things in fine-grained detail, both in space and time, in order to better understand how these events play out, how these events compound. For example, Hugh was mentioning both forest fire loss over parts of the landscape and subsequent flooding and debris flows and so forth. We've seen some of that up in the Santa Barbara area in recent years. And we desperately need more definition in our ability to describe and project these phenomena. And one bright light is that the science community is making great strides, particularly I would add in California, which is really putting a lot of attention to these issues. So I'll leave it at that for now, and back to you, Shasta.
All right, thank you, Dan. And we could continue this wonderful conversation. I have all sorts of questions, but I want to give our audience an opportunity. We've had questions rolling in throughout all of you and your discussions. So I'm going to start with a question from Sarah Brower, and this I think can apply to all of you. And she asks, do environmental regulations give you climate hope? How well do you think implementation of CEQA, mitigation for development, Clean Water Act, et cetera, are working? Do they protect us from extremes, and how could they be better? Who wants to start?
Well, I guess I have to comment on it a little bit, just because I represent the Forest Service, and of course we're heavily up to our neck in CEQA and NEPA stuff all the time. You know, that on the one hand, of course, always agencies will suggest, and I guess it's sort of cyclical depending on who's in charge of Washington to an extent, but will claim that they're kind of onerous and kind of a pain in the butt, and it's a lot of extra work to do all the analysis. By the same token, we know why those laws exist. And I don't think that I could really say offhand whether they're helping or hindering us in responding to climate change. There's certainly, if you want to expand it to kind of all of the laws and regulations that we deal with, I will say this, that in terms of, if you think back at where NEPA came from, the thing that in NEPA really became the big gorilla in the room, if you will, was sort of an innocuous statement in there that didn't really have much in the way of implementation in the original law that said, oh, and by the way, federal agencies are going to have to do these things called environmental impact statements, do some reporting and respond to public comment and stuff like that. Great idea. And of course, it's turned into a real bear. And let's be honest, it kind of created the environmental consultancy movement, which has all been great. But what I wanted to say about that was that NEPA, as a result of all that, and also CEQA too, I mean, they create a little bit of complexity for us, but they force us to spend a lot of time thinking about you know, conditions on the ground and how we impact them. And the thing that I think that is missing in NEPA, and I don't know how you get it back, is that NEPA, you know, this is a law from the 70s, and it has an implicit assumption in the law that you know, an agency or whoever, in the CEQA it's the case, it's anybody, right? But in NEPA it's federal agencies, but they actually can relatively well describe the likely outcomes of actions that they are planning to take or proposing to take on landscapes. And so it assumes that we understand where environmental baselines are and where they're going, which in these assumption of NEPA is stationarity. They're not going anywhere. And so NEPA kind of straitjackets us a little bit in the sense that it forces us to try to tell the public, you know, about the impacts, and we actually don't have any idea. We don't really know where these things are going. We don't know. We have models that tell us that climate is changing, but we really don't know what's going to happen. And so NEPA makes it difficult for us to do experimental management. And also because of NEPA, and also just because of the general, what's the right word? You know, there are certain parts of society that hold federal management agencies they see them in a very dim light, and they're not willing to give the agencies any flexibility in management. But I would say that when you read all the literature and talk to all the people who work in climate change management, flexibility is the name of the game. And if you can't, when you're doing stuff on the ground, if you can't find a way to try 3 or 4 things at once, maybe you put most of the eggs in one basket, but ensuring you put eggs in different baskets, you're not going to learn anything. I mean, humans only learn by making mistakes, right? You know that. Well, most humans learn by making mistakes anyway.
Speak for yourself.
Yeah, well, that's just science. I mean, you know, the way the brain works is people don't learn by going down the same rutted highway all the time. It's when they step out of the, you know, they push the envelope a little bit. And laws like NEPA don't let us push the envelope. And the last thing I'll say, and these are just rambling thoughts, you know, I mean, these don't represent agency policy at all. Don't forget. But, you know, the other thing is that I think most of us know that this idea of experimentalism in management is also tied to this idea of adaptive management. The idea that even if we do think we know what's going to happen, as long as we're monitoring and we have all the chains are connected and the circles are closed, you know, we can find out where we messed up and we can change what we do for the future. But the problem is it's really hard to implement. We don't get money, you know, we get annual budgets. We don't get 5-year budgets. And so you can't often commit to long monitoring. And again, I hate to criticize the public a lot on this, but the public just doesn't trust the agency enough to, so we're constantly getting yelled at for not doing adaptive management. But the minute we say, okay, well, we need flexibility to do it, we're in court immediately, as soon as we want to have any flexibility. So anyway, those are just some thoughts, but you know, with respect to CEQA and NEPA and things like that. Anyway.
So you bring up, thank you for that, and you bring up the public. You know, it sounds like from your response, I mean, there are some places to find hope in the regulations, and then there are places where the regulations have held us back. You know, but from a public standpoint of this building resilience, an important question is what do we do during the pandemic? And so there's a question about reaching out to the community. And Audrey, I want to bring you into the conversation here. How do we reach out with art to people who are locked down during the pandemic?
So this is a great little plug for the project that we've been doing this summer with the Climate Kids Connects. So that's one like virtual resource that we're kind of putting together through the Climate Science Alliance to help kids and parents kind of engage with this topic from their homes. But I think art is a really great way to kind of connect while we're all stuck at home, because it's something you can do from home. You know, it's a practice that you can develop in your life from your house with what you already have. And also it's a great way to like continue to stay connected to the environment that you live in. You know, when you don't have a choice to be anywhere but your home, you can spend a lot of time looking at birds from your window, you know, stuff like that, where it's like, okay, this is what we're going to focus on now. And it gives you the time and the space to do that. So definitely check out some of the resources we've been putting together as just like, you know, drawing activities for kids or science experiments at home, you know, stuff like that, where it's stuff that you can dedicate yourself to and practice from your house and with very limited materials. So I think art, yeah, it's a good thing to be doing right now.
Oh, I completely agree. And I think that leads into another good question about citizen science. And Laura, you brought up citizen science. So the question was directed at you, which is how can citizen science, wait, hold on, I need to find the question again. How do you see the public acting as the eyes for scientists? Do you see specific opportunities for citizen science programs to aid your work? And I'll add on to that how do we do citizen science during the pandemic?
Yeah, the last part is definitely tough, but I think that, you know, we all know that during the pandemic, many of us are stuck at home working, but we're also getting out maybe more often than we were in the past, walking at our beaches, going for a swim after work at night, taking the kids down there. So again, sometimes we lose our connection to the coast and kind of understanding what the seasonal changes are at our beaches, understanding how wide they are in the summer, you know, right now, and how they might change in the fall, what's recently happened, you know, along those areas. And so, so I do think that for all of our areas, not just the coast, local and citizen observations are going to be key. Understanding, you know, what what temperature is at somebody's house, you know, in Escondido, and what somebody's temperature is along the coast is really important for us to understand, like during one day at one time, like how these compare and what extremes we're seeing in these microclimates across San Diego County, and how to better prepare for those. So I think there is a huge push and right now to kind of increase through the research institutions to increase that connection with our communities and to absorb community science and observations. At this point, photos and videos are the most helpful things, and you're free to send them to me, especially on, for king tides or around when things have flooded. I'm always searching the web looking for photos from flood events because we can't get to every community. So even as you're going out there now, and it may not be an extreme day, just starting to maybe implement your own practice of photographing or looking at one area and taking note of how that changes over time starts to build awareness of, you know, what does our backyard really look like and how does it shift and change, and then what are we really talking about in terms of what this might look like in the future. So I think for our coastal systems, like I said, we are in a very challenging world of having overdeveloped most of our coastlines, and so much of our sort of development and our communities are at risk. And we are going to have to think very strongly about how to sort of re-envision those coasts, allow them to be, you know, continue to be access points for people to use, especially during things like the pandemic. You're seeing how much people really value that open space. But we also have to really start to work together to get creative and think how to build back some of our natural systems that can increase our buffer and our resilience as we maybe take away, we have a lot of infrastructure that's aging out. There's real opportunity for getting rid of those aged out infrastructure on the coastline and re-envisioning those coastal areas and using that, as we talked about, as experiments and pilots for adapting. And we can't go back in history. We cannot build the wetlands like they historically were. I wish we could. But we also have to recognize that those wetlands need a space to move and to transition, and those species and habitats need a place to go. And so we really have to figure out how to reintegrate those sort of green ecosystem services, maybe not, a tree by tree, but the services that they provide. We have to think about how to reintegrate those into our actual communities, into more of our hard structure in our home-based systems.
So you bring up ecosystem services, which every time I hear that, I think it's the name of the company that picks up my trash. But I know that that's not what ecosystem services means. It's what the plants, the animals, the ecosystem, the benefits that it provides to the ecosystem. So another question, and Dan, this one is for you. It has to do with what I've learned to call coastal low clouds and fog, but most people call it the marine layer. So the question is the ecosystem that relies on the marine layer at risk? And is there any research being done on that?
Yes. Well, it's interesting. That's a really important and not really entirely unique, but certainly a feature of our Southern California climate, and the duration and interior extent of that coastal low cloud, whether it's fog or higher stratus, in providing shading and air conditioning is critical. And I'm sure that a lot of the ecological communities have built up, evolved, dependent on that phenomena. The coastal low cloud historical record is one that is extremely volatile, as we all know. We can have weeks where we're socked in, and other weeks where the high pressure regime and subsidence descending air is really totally inhibiting the cloud layer. That exists both on the weather time scale, but also on seasonal and year-to-year time scales. It's hard to detect a signal of change over the longer records that we have, although there is some evidence that coastal cloudiness is diminishing. Part of that may be anthropogenic, aerosol, particulates, and so forth related. Climate models are generally computed over broad tiles of calculations, and they don't have the boundary layer information to really accurately predict our coastal cloud environment. But that's where this so-called downscaling activity comes in. And that's one aspect that really needs attention in moving forward, is to look at the disposition of coastal clouds. In the future, there's some evidence that coastal clouds are to some extent diminishing, but I would say that that's pretty tenuous and needs a lot more attention. Shasta, I just wanted to jump in on 2 sentences regarding the citizen science aspect. I would note that some of the most important terrestrial climate records we have our cooperative observer temperatures, precipitation, and snowfall over the not only the United States but elsewhere, that gives us a view of what climate has done historically. And the other thing I would note is that there is a network of phenological observations, the timing of plant development, first bloom, and so forth, that any citizen can get involved with. This is being organized out of the University of Arizona. So that's a wonderful way to participate and learn about the environment and also contribute to our collective understanding.
Thank you, Dan. And we have just a few minutes remaining. So I want to remind our audience that if we didn't get to your question, use the Padlet app or the Padlet function. You can put your question in there and any of our panelists can go back and answer those questions one-on-one so you get the answer you're looking for. But I want to just take these last couple of minutes and I want each of you to address this important question, the theme of our overall conference here, which is what gives you climate hope? And Audrey, I want to start with you.
I'm sorry, it cut out for a sec. Did you say you're starting with me?
Yes, I did.
Okay, thanks. Sorry, my Wi-Fi is kind of bad. But what gives me climate hope? I think that when I was originally asked that question, it's kind of a tricky answer because as a student of environmental science, it's really easy to lose hope when it's just every day I'm learning more ways that things are going wrong, right? But then coming to things like this is what gives me hope because I see that, I'm not a researcher. I'm learning what the researchers are learning. And a lot of it seems really difficult. But then coming to things like this, where I see really competent, wonderful people that are working so hard to make a better world for my generation gives me hope because everybody is doing such a good job. They're doing the best that they can, and I see people that really, really care and have spent their whole lives caring about this, to kind of pave the way for students like myself who also really care to come in and see what we can do better. So yeah, thank you. You guys give me hope.
And same. Hugh, how about you? And you've got about 15 seconds.
Well, as an ecologist, I'm sort of consigned to being sort of a realist and surrounded by doom pretty much. But I would say that organizations like the California Climate Alliance and the USGS Southwest Climate Adaptation Science Center give me a lot of hope because they're really committed people who want to invest time and money and effort in bringing people together to try to solve the problem. I think like most big problems, they can look absolutely untractable in the long run, but you just got to get your head down and start making steps, and you might get there.
All right, thanks. And Laura.
Yeah, same here for me in the coastal system. As I mentioned, there's so much room for innovation and for experimentation. And so we're really starting to just begin some of those thought processes of like, how do we get away from engineering walls and how do we kind of reuse and reestablish, beaches the way that they used to look, and some of our, coastal systems. And so there's a real opportunity for interdisciplinary and great collaborations and really understanding how everybody uses the coast, not just the people that live on the coast. And so I'm starting to see a lot more of those types of conversations. So that brings me hope. And I do think that out of the box thinking is absolutely required for where we are and where we're going in the future.
And Dan, that leaves you with the last word. So, five words or less.
Humans are adaptable, inventive, we need to, I think we need to do more of this, talk to each other, learn from each other. Science is evolving. Not everything is going to be adaptation will probably, as time goes on, there'll be technological solutions to some of these problems. So I guess that's where I have to put my hope for the future, is that we are able to use our creativity and intellect to help us here. Not to say that there's not tremendous problems.
Well, with that, we're wrapping it up, and I want to give like virtual high fives to all of our panelists. Thank you so much for your wonderful words and participation. And for our audience, we will see you in about 30 minutes for the Building Resilient Communities panel. Thank you, everyone.
Thanks, Shasta. Cheers.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, Shasta.